next 30 minutes, I'm going to be talking about why you need to terminate. Why was I asked to come here from Arkansas to talk about cover crop termination? When you need to terminate your cover crops, how to kill your cover crops, and then lastly, a little bit about high tunnel grapes. So termination. So why? The biggest thing is weed seeds. Just making sure your cover crop doesn't become a weed problem, right? I mean, we're talking about purslane. With that, it's not just a weed seed, it's also parts of the plant, propagating from that. But, a big thing with cover crops is, there's so many benefits of cover crops, but if you let your cover crops go to seed and become a weed problem, they're a weed just like any other weed on your farm. So a big thing is terminating before you develop hard seed. Also, depending on your strategy, termination and then incorporation is going to allow you to return that carbon that's in the cover crop residue, return that back to the soil. And that's one of the big benefits of cover crops, which I'm sure you heard over and over again yesterday, was building soil carbon, increasing soil organic matter, feeding the soil microbiome, with that carbon. And so, terminating, mowing, cover crops, and then returning them to the soil is a great way to infuse that carbon in the soil. And then also you have to think about what comes after the cover crops. You're going to be planting a vegetable crop, so if you're doing any kind of seeding, you need a good seed bed for that. We were talking about strip tillage, so that might be a planting scenario you're using. Even, using a roller-crimper and transplanting into that. All these strategies involve killing that cover crop so you can prepare the ground for your next cash crop. All right, so when to terminate? And this is very critical. Timing is incredibly important when it comes to cover crops. So, you guys probably talked yesterday about stages of development. You have the vegetative stage in a cover crop and then the reproductive stage. So just thinking about plant physiology for a minute, in this vegetative stage, the plant is focusing all of its energy on stem, shoot growth, leaf growth. It's just pushing out, a lot of new growth. It is much harder to kill a cover crop when it's at the vegetative stage. But if you wait until it gets to the reproductive phase, when it starts to develop flower structures and starts to develop, early forms of seed, this is where that cover crop's going to be much easier to kill. It's naturally at the end of its life cycle. When it comes to different cover crops, there are different signs of when they're in that reproductive stage. Dr. Nair was talking about anthesis for rye. So here's a visual of that. So the beginning of the reproductive stage, with rye, grains like wheat, when they're in the boot, so you can start to see that seed head, that swelling of the stem, at the very top of the shoot. So this is the beginning of the reproductive stage. And then it gets into anthesis. You can see the pollen, on the early stages of that seed head. And then it gets to the soft dough stage, which you can start to see the seed, and if you squeeze it, it's like soft dough squeezing out. It's not going to be hard. It's kind of going to be milky. These are all, within that reproductive stage window when you can terminate rye. The later you get, the easier it is to kill, either by mowing or rolling and crimping it. You just don't want to get beyond the soft dough stage, because once that seed is hard, then you're going to have rye seed back in the soil and it can become a weed problem. So that's just a visual depiction of that reproductive window for rye, and also it's very similar for grains like wheat. So for broadleaf crops like crimson clover here's a photo of mustard. You can judge it by looking at the flowers. So when those broadleaf cover crops it's usually 10 to 50% flower, that's when you want to terminate. And so why it's 10 to 50% flower, if you wait till later, you're going to start to have hard seed developed. If you look at, for mustard, not all the flowers bloom at once. And so, later on, when you have the later flowers that are blooming, you're already going to have some hard seed developing. So you want to catch it when it's kind of the beginning of that flowering stage. Same thing for crimson clover and hairy vetch and all those great legumes. So when they're most beautiful, when those flowers are blooming, that's when you want to terminate. It's very easy to visualize that, to see that. So just looking at a calendar to kind of reinforce this. So for winter cover crops, you're planting mid-September. So, I like to say by September 15th. Might be a little different here. Is that about right? September 15th? Okay. That's when you're planting, and then termination is going to be mid-April, when the crimson clover is in bloom, which I love driving through eastern Oklahoma because there's all kinds of crimson clover on the side of the highway. But usually that's around mid-April, early to mid-April. That's when you want to terminate your winter cover crops. So for summer cover crops, planting, usually early May, maybe late April, depending on how the season's going. And then termination. With summer cover crops, it's a little different. There are several different strategies. Winter kill is an option. I'll talk about that more in a second. Usually termination is in late July or early to mid-August. A lot of it depends on what you're doing after that summer cover crop. So summer cover crops like sorghum, Sudan grass, you can mow them several times in the season and they'll come back and keep growing. And really you're kind of choosing when to terminate and when to incorporate usually to then prepare the field to plant your fall crop. So this termination date is not as hard, not as set in stone. If you're growing a summer cover crop like buckwheat, like cowpea, a broadleaf that's setting hard seed, you want to make sure to kill it before you set that hard seed. With these summer grasses, you tend to have a little more flexibility there. And another option is to plant late and to let these tropical summer annuals winter kill. So if you subject them to a frost, they'll actually die naturally. And a lot of that depends on where you are in the state, how hard your freeze is. You're leaving it up to a lot of weather variables, but that's another option. I said July to August because you definitely want to terminate your summer cover crop in time to either plant a fall cover crop or plant your fall vegetable crop. So a lot of this comes down to how you're managing tillage. So we talked this morning about conservation tillage. That's a fantastic option. I would imagine for most of you, you're still using more traditional tillage for vegetable production or grains or whatever you're growing. So we'll talk about those two different strategies. So I'm going to call it conventional tillage. It's really the most efficient way to get cover crop nitrogen back into the soil. Okay, so with everything there are trade-offs, right? And I'm sure a lot of you know tillage does lead to carbon loss, oxidation of organic matter. It can damage soil structure, especially if you're tilling frequently, several times in a year. But it is a really good way to get that carbon and that nitrogen that's in the cover crop biomass, get it in the soil so the microbes can start working on it. And if your goal is being able to supplement nitrogen fertilizer by growing legume cover crops, incorporating that cover crop, tilling it into the soil is the best way to get that nitrogen in the soil for your next crop. So before you get that cover crop in the soil, you need to mow it down, right? Brush hog is a great option for a lot of farms. A lot of farms have brush hogs. So it works great. There's really no problem with it. Like I said, it's kind of the second best option. I'll show you a flail mower, which I would consider to be the best option. This works great for most farms. And there are even brush hogs made for two-wheel tractors that you can use on a small scale. Very small scale, a weed eater can work, Just some way to cut it down, chop up that cover crop so you can incorporate it into the soil. So a flail mower, it's a little better than a brush hog just because of the way the flail mower works. It's doing more chopping. I don't know if you've seen the inside of a flail mower, but you have an axis and you have blades that are spinning on that axis instead of blades that are spinning like a lawnmower. So it's just doing more chopping, more mulching, getting a finer size, smaller particle size of that cover crop, so it's going to decompose more rapidly in the soil. And there are even flail mowers that are made for two-wheel tractors if you're small scale. Grazing is another option. Most people don't think about this, but if you have small ruminants, sheep, goats, this is a great option to be able to, mow down, graze down your cover crop before incorporating it. There are a lot of other considerations, things to think about, things to manage with livestock in cover crops. Fencing to keep them in. You could use mobile electric fencing, with solar chargers, that would be a good option. Also, food safety considerations, it's really important to think about this. This would be an application of fresh manure. Okay, so you need to think about whatever standard you're using, if you're certified organic or if you're following, FSMA produce safety rule guidelines or GAP standards. This would be a manure application. So that's something you have to consider, but it's a good option. And also, having the ruminants process that cover crop, you actually get more biological activity in that manure. You just have a richer microbial makeup of that manure. So it can improve the soil microbiome, having grazing animals mow down your cover crop. Usually, disking, plowing, tilling the cover crop is a second stage. If your cover crop is manageable enough, not too tall, you could even skip mowing potentially and just you plow it in or till it in. Some people do that. The thing is, that would work better for winter cover crops. Maybe if you have a shorter stand of rye or you have field peas, clover, it would be possible to just till it in. But if you have a really thick stand of cover crop, it's going to be more efficiently incorporated if you mow it first. And so incorporation techniques, plowing, using braking discs, using a tiller or a spader, these will all work. A lot of it just depends on what implements you have on your farm. Definitely disking would be the least invasive way to do it. Minimal soil disturbance with that. Plowing is the most soil disturbance, and then tilling is somewhere in between. Considerations with incorporation. You want to incorporate that cover crop as soon as you can after mowing. Okay, you don't want to just sitting there after being mowed because that cover crop residue is going to start breaking down. And for example, if you're wanting to maximize nitrogen contribution, some of that nitrogen is going to start to be released. So you want to incorporate that cover crop as soon after mowing as you can. But then after you incorporate, you'll need to wait around 3 weeks before you can plant into that because you need to give time for that cover crop residue to break down in the soil. It's kind of like that cover crop is composting in the soil. So you need to allow time for that decomposition. The smaller the particle size, the faster the decomposition. So you might be able to get away with just waiting 2 weeks if you use a flail mower, if you mow it really fine. And for example, if you were just to disc in a cover crop without mowing it first, you might have to wait a little longer because you might have longer stems, more residue that would need longer to break down. So no-till options. We talked about the benefits of no-till, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But if you're wanting to manage cover crops in a no-till conservation tillage system, you can still mow your cover crop, but you'd want to mow it with something like a sickle bar mower. You're just mowing right at the base of that cover crop. It's like cutting hay. And then what you have the whole stem, the above ground portion of that plant is preserved. And so if you let it dry on the surface, it makes a great mulch material that you could even move to other areas, and it's minimal soil disturbance underneath. Small scale version of that, which I've used in my garden at home, is a grass sickle. You can cut down your cover crop with that. Just somehow cutting that cover crop right at the base of the plant, and if it's in the reproductive phase, it's not going to regrow from there. Roller-crimper, we talked a lot about that. One thing we didn't mention was a roller-crimper for a BCS tractor, a walk-behind roller-crimper. My experience with that at the Kerr Center was that it worked okay for grains like rye, but for especially hairy vetch, even clover somewhat, that were more lower growing, they tended to just bounce back. It was hard to get enough weight on that roller to really crimp the stems of legumes, broadleafs like hairy vetch and clover. But it's an option, it's something you could experiment with. And so then planting into no-till cover crops, just some more pictures. And one thing we did at the Kerr Center was, and this was in a strip tillage situation. I had a Three Sisters trial with corn, squash, and beans. We actually used a stand-in planter to plant. In this case, we were planting beans. We used it for the corn as well, just to kind of open up a planting hole, drop the seed in that, to be able to plant into some cover crop residue that was left on the soil surface. But naturally, there are no-till seed drills that you could use on a larger scale to plant into cover crop residue. And even no-till transplanters that are available to plant through cover crop residue, which a lot of work on these is being done in Auburn by Ted Kernecki. And you can see some great YouTube videos on no-till transplanters he's developed for small tractors and two-wheel tractors that can transplant into a rolled cover crop mulch. So there are a lot of options out there for planting into minimal till systems with cover crops. But as I mentioned before, if you're mowing that cover crop with a sickle bar mower and using it as a mulch, kind of an in situ, in place mulch that you're growing, you could just leave it on the soil surface, kind of like a roller-crimper system. Or what we did at the Kerr Center is we would actually rake it over to another part of the plot and use it as mulch. So essentially, we were growing our own mulch. It was a rye clover cover crop. Growing that cover crop, mowing it, letting it dry, then raking it and using it to mulch summer crops like tomatoes. You can think of it as we are moving carbon from one part of the plot to another with the idea that eventually we would move some carbon back to replenish. But that gives you a lot of options, mowing down the cover crop with a sickle bar and using it as mulch. On the garden scale, I mentioned you could use a grass sickle to cut your cover crop. And so here's a photo from my garden at home where I had cover crops growing in this plot where I had the tomatoes. I cut them with a sickle, rake the cover crops aside. In this case, I just used a stirrup hoe to work the soil to plant my tomatoes, and then I move the mulch back over it. So even in a small scale scenario, you can use the same methods, the same principles to grow cover crops and grow your own mulch for your garden. So some potential pitfalls to talk about with cover crops, it's definitely worth mentioning. So planting too late is a big problem I see, an issue I see a lot of farmers encounter, where they're not prioritizing planting their cover crops. They'll plant them when they get around to it. It's too late in the season, they don't get good germination, don't get a good stand, and so you end up with a weedy field with some cover crops. So really making sure you're planting your cover crops on time is important. Terminating them in time so they don't become a weed problem. Just another thing you really have to think about, if you're incorporating your cover crop or you're planning to incorporate, allowing that 3-week time window between incorporation and planting. That's something you really have to plan for, and especially when it comes to summer cash crops planted after a winter cover crop, making sure that you're realizing that it's going to result in a later planting of your summer crop, because you have to wait for that cover crop incorporation and that breakdown of the residue. Another thing that you'll notice, if you have a thick stand of grass like sorghum Sudan grass or maybe just ryegrass or cereal rye without many legumes, and you have a carbon-rich biomass that you're incorporating, you can actually tie up nitrogen that's in the soil. It's kind of like in a compost pile. If you have a lot of brown materials, a lot of wood chips, those microbes aren't getting enough nitrogen. So the same thing can happen with cover crops. If you're incorporating a lot of carbon-rich biomass into the soil, it can actually tie up nitrogen and make it less available to a subsequent vegetable crop. So making sure you have a good balance of your grasses and legumes, so you have a good carbon to nitrogen balance is important. And just monitoring your subsequent cash crop to make sure that it has the nitrogen it needs. Some early season fertilization might be needed if you do have that nitrogen tie-up. And then cold soils, which is something we were talking about with Dr. Nair's data. But having a winter cover crop in your field in the spring, it will result in your soils not warming as quickly as if you had a bare soil. So those are some pitfalls to avoid. Just quickly, my favorite cover crops, people often ask this. So for summer cover crops, love sorghum Sudan grass, also known as sudac. Cowpeas are fantastic. That's a good mix, just those two. Cowpeas, I would recommend iron and clay is a good variety of cowpea as a cover crop. And if you want to get a little funky, you can mix in some Sunn hemp, which is a great tropical legume, good nitrogen fixation. It grows really tall, we're talking 6 to 8 feet tall. Sunn hemp has a woody fibrous stem, so you need to have a good way to be able to mow it down and incorporate it. And it's actually related to cannabis, so it has leaves that look like cannabis leaves. Just make sure you tell your neighbors that you're not growing cannabis. Winter cover crops, winter rye and crimson clover are a fantastic pair. They go really well together. You could also mix in some Austrian winter peas. And Austrian winter peas are great if you have a small plot. Maybe you're planting your cover crop late. You can plant Austrian winter peas as late as November, and you'll get germination and a decent stand. You get a lot of growth on this in the spring. So as long as you can get it in the ground in the fall, you'll usually get a lot of biomass in the spring and good nitrogen fixation. Resources, Again, I'm going to refer you to our ATRA website, atra.ncat.org. SEER has fantastic resources on cover crops, so I would recommend that. And before you leave, be sure to pick up this overview of cover crops and green manures ATRA publication I brought. A project I'm very excited to be involved in, and we're in the final year of the project, is a study on growing table grapes in high tunnels. And just going to quickly mention this and refer you to the ATRA publication I brought, our first publication on high tunnel grapes. We're going to do a series of 5 ATRA publications. We also have YouTube videos on growing grapes in high tunnels on our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and you search NCAT ATRA, you'll find our NCAT YouTube channel, and we have a playlist for our high tunnel grape videos. It's really exciting. You're talking about table grapes coming into production 1 to 2 years earlier than grapes in the field. Yield increases of up to 4 times yield increase in the tunnel. And especially here in the humid southeast, keeping the rain off the leaves of the grapes really helps with disease control. So you're looking at really reducing the number of fungicide applications you have to make. And just look at these pictures of those grapes. I mean, isn't that beautiful, right? So pretty. If you're interested, check out the publication, and I'd be happy to talk. Kind of talking through this scenario, maybe what would be ideal for terminating these summer cover crops. And I know you're limited by equipment, right? And that's a big thing, is having the right equipment to manage your cover crops effectively. But one thing I wanted to note, you can tell it's termination time, right? You see the Sunn hemp, the crotalaria is flowering, right? So if you want to prevent that from forming seed, you would want to go ahead and terminate this cover crop. You can also see seed heads on the sorghum Sudan grass. If you notice that, kind of looks like Johnson grass. So it would be time to terminate if that's what you wanted to do and you wanted to prevent seed from being formed. Ideally, on this scale, having a BCS with a brush hog on it or flail mower, like you talked about, those 2 implements on a BCS tractor would be able to handle this amount of biomass. You might have to make multiple passes because the Sunn hemp is pretty woody. But a BCS with a good mower attachment would be able to handle it. And I was even thinking about it, if you wanted to do more minimal till, conservation tillage, and you didn't have to plant anything this winter, you could just tarp everything, tarp the residue with black plastic, like the JM4TA method, occultation, and let that black plastic kind of heat up that residue, help it break down through the wintertime. And then in early spring, you'd be able to remove the plastic and you should have a good seed bed. You might have to do a little bit of secondary tillage, but that would probably deal with the residue quite effectively, tarping it. Or, incorporating like I talked about and then waiting several weeks, 3 weeks for it to break down and then planting into it. But since it's late in the season, if I were in charge of it, I'd probably mow it and then tarp it and then be ready to plant early in the spring.